The supply boat scraped against the cement landing just long enough for me to throw my duffel onto the rocks. Cormorant Point rose above us in a slab of wet granite. The lighthouse itself a pale finger pointing into a sky the colour of old pewter. Halloran was already waiting on the path, hands jammed into the pockets of a coat too thin for November. He was thinner than the coat. His eyes had the bruised look of a man who had stopped sleeping some while ago and made peace with it. He did not offer to help. When I started toward the cottage with my bags, he stayed planted on the gravel as if a line had been drawn there that he could not cross. He held out a laminated sheet, the edges worn soft from handling. "Lamp's the easy part," he said. His voice was flat, rehearsed. "Rules are on there, follow them." I took the list. He was already turning back toward the boat. "One more thing." He paused without looking at me. "The door only ever needs to be opened from the outside." The engine coughed. By the time I understood I had a question, the boat was a smudge on the grey water, pulling away faster than it had come. The cottage smelled of damp wool and old wick smoke. I set the kettle on the hob and listened to it find its voice while I spread the laminated sheet flat on the kitchen table, smoothing the soft curl at its edges with my palm. Most of it was what I'd expected. Check the lamp at dusk. Log the weather in the book by the radio. Ration the kerosene. Do not let the brass tarnish. Sweep the gallery after gales. Practical things, the sort of list a man writes when he's tired of explaining himself. 3 lines sat lower on the page, set apart by a hand's width of empty plastic. Do not answer knocks before midnight. Do not answer knocks after midnight. If you hear your own voice on the other side of the door, do not speak back. I read them twice. The kettle began to hiss in earnest, a thin white sound climbing the stone walls. I laughed. It came out of me small and dry, and the room took it and gave it back changed, narrower, somehow further away than my own mouth. I stopped laughing. The kettle went on without me. The first 2 nights passed the way a held breath passes. I climbed the spiral stairs at dusk, my hand trailing the cold iron rail, and tended the lamp until the lens threw its slow wheel of light out across the water. I wrote in the log in the small neat hand my mother had taught me. Wind moderate, sea slight, visibility good. The brass kept its shine, the kerosene held. On the 3rd evening I walked the rocks at low tide, picking my way between weed and tidal pools that held the sky in pieces. I was almost back to the path when I saw them. A second set of boot prints in the wet sand coming up out of the water and going straight to the cottage door. None returned. I stood over them for a long time. The size was mine. The tread, when I lifted my own foot to check, was mine. The tide was already beginning to lick at the heels of the nearer prints, softening them, taking them back. Inside, the boots by the door were dry. I touched the leather to be sure. That night I wrote in the log, a trick of the light. I underlined it twice. The 4th night gave me nothing, which I should have recognised as a kind of warning. On the 5th I was reading by the radio when the knocking came. 3 soft taps, no more insistent than a neighbour calling round for sugar. The clock on the shelf read 11:15. I set the book down very slowly, as if the sound of a page settling might be heard through stone. I didn't answer. The taps came again a few minutes later, in the same patient rhythm, neither louder nor softer. Then again, then again. Whoever it was had all the time in the world and intended to use it. After the 4th round, a voice spoke through the wood. It said my name the way a friend says it when he is late and slightly embarrassed, drawing out the middle, almost laughing. I knew the voice. I could not place it, and the not placing was worse than the knowing would have been. The knocking stopped on the first stroke of midnight, cleanly, as though a hand had been lifted. I sat in the chair until the window paled. I was fully dressed. I was holding the kettle by the handle. In the morning I went to the radio with the steadiness of a man who has decided to be reasonable. I asked after Halloran. I asked lightly, the way you ask after a cousin. The dispatcher on the mainland was a woman called Maeve, whose voice I had come to know by its small dry coughs, and she did not cough now. She paused. The pause went on a beat longer than a pause should, and in that quiet I heard the hiss of the open channel, and beneath it, the sea. Halloran, she said, finished his rotation last spring. He has not been back since. The man on the supply boat was a stranger, hired for the handover and gone the same afternoon. I described him. The thin face, the careful voice, the way he held his cap by the brim as if it might fly. Maeve was quiet again. Then she said gently, That sounds like the keeper from 2 rotations before that. A man who walked into the sea one February and was never recovered. The static rose to meet her last word and swallowed whatever came after. I looked to the window. The tide was coming in fast. The knocking came back before the sun had finished going down. It started at the kitchen window, 3 soft notes against the salt-crusted glass, the way a child taps to be noticed. I was setting the kettle down and I froze with my hand still on the handle. By the time I turned, the sound had moved. The seaward shutter took it up next, 3 notes again, patient, almost polite, against wood that no living arm could reach without a ladder and a great deal of nerve. I climbed the spiral to the lamp because the lamp was my work and my work was the only rope I had. I trimmed the wick with hands that would not quite settle. Above me, on the trapdoor that opened to the gallery, 3 small knocks fell like coins onto a plate. Then the brass speaking tube beside the lens whispered. The voice that came up through it was my own, easy, almost amused, saying that it was cold out here and the boat was so far away, and would I please be a good fellow and let it in. I clamped both palms over the mouth of the tube and didn't answer. By the 10th night I had stopped sleeping in any honest sense. I closed my eyes between tasks and opened them to find the kettle, whistling, or the lamp guttering, or my own hand resting on a doorknob I did not remember reaching for. The rules were taped to every door and every mirror now, in ink that had begun to bleed at the edges from the damp. The cottage felt smaller. The walls did not move, but the distance between them had shortened, in some way I could measure only by how often my shoulder met the jamb. I opened the logbook for comfort, because the logbook was a thing I had made with my own hand. The early entries were mine. The later entries were also mine. They were not the same. The loops in the later letters leaned a fraction further, as though written by someone learning me. Pages had been added that I had not written. One, dated 3 days from now, said only, "Today, I finally answered." I tore it loose and fed it to the stove. The ashes shifted in the draught, settled into the same 6 words, held the shape a long moment, and then crumbled. On the final night the knocking did not come at all. I waited for it the way a man waits for a heartbeat he has grown used to listening for, and the absence opened a hole in the air of the cottage that nothing else could fill. The wind kept on. The sea kept on. The lamp turned its slow, patient circle. But the small, polite sound that had counted out my hours was gone, and the silence it left was the worst thing I had ever heard. At 1 minute past midnight, a floorboard sighed in the kitchen, then another, nearer. Footsteps, unhurried, familiar, came along the hallway in the cadence I knew because it was my own. They stopped outside the bedroom in which I stood. A soft knock fell against the inside of the door behind me. I understood then. I had been the one outside all this time, knocking to be let back in. I remembered with a clarity that emptied me, stepping off the supply boat onto an empty jetty and finding the cottage door already open to the dark. Out on the rocks, a thin man in a keeper's coat raised one hand in apology and walked quietly down into the tide.